Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to the second in a series of webinars from the Australian Domestic and Family Violence Clearinghouse. Today's webinar topic is how immigrant and refugee women resist violence. My name is Beck Eckert. I work as a good practice officer here at the Clearinghouse, and it's my pleasure to be with you for the webinar today and to be introducing our fantastic guest speaker, Cecilia Barassi-Rubio, who's the Director from the Immigrant Women's Support Service in Queensland. Before I introduce the webinar and start the process, first we'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land the Clearinghouse sits and pay our respect to elders past and present. So we have a range of people attending the webinar today, so we're really excited to not only hear from Cecilia but also to hear your questions as well as we go through the presentation. So today's webinar will look at identifying, acknowledging and honouring the way immigrant and refugee women resist violence and demonstrate resilience in the context of domestic and or sexual violence. So it's obviously a very critical topic and one that's an area of a lot of passion for a number of people, and no doubt those of you who are listening. And we're very excited, as I said, to have Cecilia with us today all the way from Brisbane to share her particular experience with us. The way the webinar will work today is that Cecilia will spend the first 40 minutes or so sharing her work in Queensland and the work of her particular organisation, and then we'll have about 15-20 minutes at the end for questions. So please feel free to send your questions through throughout the webinar, and we'll try to make sure we get through to them, as many of them as we can, towards the end of the presentation. So I'm just going to now hand over to Cecilia. Bear with us as we work our technical magic and switch our headsets over, so you haven't lost us. We're just doing a transfer. But I look forward to hearing some of your questions as we go through today and to what Cecilia has to share with us.
Yep. Thank you. As I was introduced, I'm Cecilia Barassi from the Immigrant Women's Support Service in Brisbane, and first of all I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the past and current custodian of this land in which we gather today. Today's presentation is about the findings of a small research project on resistance and resilience and immigrant and refugee women, conducted by a student on placement. Her name is Isabel Ball from the Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. She did her placement in Brisbane with us. This version of this research project includes what Isabel did as part of her placement, plus some other information gathered from annual reports and anecdotal information. In supervising Isabel's 5-week placement at IWES, she undertook a literature review on resistance and resilience and immigrant and refugee women. The project also included the review of a total of 26 files chosen at random over a 6-month of support period. Of the 26 files, 10 were from women presenting with domestic violence issues, 10 from women presenting with sexual assault issues, and 6 files were from women presenting with both sexual assault and domestic violence. The women were aged on average between 28 and 40 and represented 22 countries. The Immigrant Women's Support Service provides a domestic violence and sexual assault service response in Brisbane. Just the one before. Oh, sorry, we just missed a slide. That's fine. I'll just talk through it. So we provide service to immigrant and refugee women of non-English speaking backgrounds and their children. As we embark on a journey with each individual woman accessing support from IWES, we bear witnesses to the women's pain and effort to overcome the many challenges resulting from trying to change the circumstances that bring them to the service. The information sourced from the file review was taken from notes and summaries of services sought by the women and provided or facilitated by the IOS case workers. The information was provided voluntarily by the women as they told us their stories. Apart from asking some questions about demographics, the caseworkers let the women tell their stories first. Then, in conjunction with the women, they develop support plans and safety plans in order to respond to the women's needs and priorities. I believe that by having an understanding of how women resist violence, we can develop service responses that are more meaningful to the women. So now I would like to move on to the reasons why women come to Australia. And there are many reasons, as you all know. Some women might come here because of marriage, or they might be refugees escaping from political conflict in the countries of origin. Some women come as tourists, others for employment reasons, education, family reunion. These are the main reasons why the women who come to our service have, disclosed to us. So in coming to Australia, all migrants might face some settlement challenges, and changes, of course. And according to some researchers, I won't going to be reading all the researchers and to acknowledge them, because we're acknowledging them at the end, and they are noted in the slides just for the sake of time. But people who migrate to Australia usually face the challenge of learning to live in a new country, and in many cases having to deal with significant cultural differences that might cause tension and stresses. That is, called acculturation. Although there are benefits of moving from one culture to another, the stressors can be considerable, making settlement difficulty, particularly if gender roles are challenged. However, regardless of the difficulties resulting from the settlement process, this should never be an excuse to justify violence against women and children, or violence of any type. Another settlement challenge is social isolation, which may also affect a person's settlement process. This includes lack of or loss of social networks, as it is not unusual for women to have no extended family or close friends in Australia. Isolation might also be used as a tactic by perpetrators to prevent women from seeking and receiving help, and to maintain the power and control over the women. Social isolation also might include isolation from the community if the woman discloses the domestic violence or sexual assault to others. Discrimination can happen at different levels, from gender discrimination to discrimination in the workplace and racial discrimination, and I'm sure you are familiar about this issue. The lack of resources, which is another settlement challenge, might result from being financially dependent on the perpetrator of the abuse, or by the perpetrator exerting financial control over the women. Lack of resources is also about not having knowledge about resources available, or not being entitled to resources and benefits, such as Centrelink, Medicare, and public housing. This is very relevant to women on temporary visas who, due to their immigration status, are not entitled to apply for income support, medical services, or public housing. The other settlement challenge is violence. And violence can take many forms. For this presentation today, I'll be talking about immigrant and refugee women who have experienced domestic violence, sexual assault, or both. And sometimes I'll be talking about sexual violence. And I won't be providing a definition of domestic violence as in Australia we have different laws across the states and territories. But in general terms, I'm referring to psychological, physical, economic, sexual, and social abuse within a context of power and control, mainly by men over women. Similarly, according to the Australian Centre for the Study of Sexual Assault, sexual violence or sexual assault doesn't have a common definition in Australia, but it refers to sexual harassment, unwanted behavior such as kissing or physical contact forced sexual activity, sexual pressure and coercion, and it also includes sexualized bullying. A recent report from the World Health Organization, released in June 2013, found that 35% of women around the world have experienced physical and or sexual abuse by an intimate partner or non-partner. The report by the World Health Organization reflects the status of women around the globe, an alarming reality that is also experienced by immigrant and refugee women living in Australia. Violence against women of non-English speaking backgrounds, and I'm aware that some people might talk about women from diverse cultural background or culturally and diverse linguistic backgrounds. I'll continue using non-English speaking backgrounds. The National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and the Children, 2010-2022, recognizes that domestic violence and sexual assault are the most pervasive forms of violence experienced by women in Australian society. The National Plan also acknowledges that some group of women experiencing violence will have limited access to services or they might have specific needs. Women from non-English speaking backgrounds are included in these groups. But also the women from non-English speaking backgrounds experience a double power imbalance as women in a male-dominated society and as members of non-dominant cultural groups. IWES has over 27 years experience delivering services to women and their children who have experienced violence. As such, we are aware of the double power imbalance experienced by immigrant and refugee women. This power imbalance becomes very, very real when the women's access to services and resources is restricted or denied on the basis of their immigration status. Despite the many challenges faced by immigrant and refugee women who have experienced domestic or sexual violence, we have learned a great deal in the process of providing support services and listening to the women's stories. The women's strengths, wisdom, and determination give us the impetus to continue working with the women and on their behalf to improve their circumstances and help them achieve a life free from violence. In this process, we have learned about women's resistance to violence and their resilience. This slide is called Celebrating Resistance and Resilience because we believe that it's important to acknowledge the efforts the women make when they are in situations of abuse. And this is because, according to research, the day-to-day acts of resistance often go unrecognized by the women themselves, sometimes by other parties and by the perpetrators. And they are rarely appreciated for the strength required on the person experiencing the violence. Identifying, acknowledging, and celebrating the way immigrant and refugee women have resisted violence and demonstrated resilience throughout life challenges can be a constructive way for generating and promoting more meaningful relationships between women accessing support services and services providers. The research project conducted by IWES resulted from an interest in gaining a better understanding of the stories the women tell us and how to better understand how they have managed to survive situations of abuse and violence with a view to build on what they already know or to make them aware of their effort and successes in trying to free themselves from violence. In terms of resistance, women who have lived through domestic or sexual assault are often labeled as victims, and this is a term that is rejected by women, especially feminist women providing services, because these were terms to describe a woman who has experienced abuse as a person who has been helpless and passive in stopping the perpetrator's abuse. And I guess in many ways it doesn't put the responsibility of the abuse on the perpetrator. This view fails to recognize that many acts of daily resistance that women utilize against the perpetrators of violence. As a service, at the Immigrant Women Support Service, we already knew before undertaking the research project that women resist violence. However, we're also aware that some of the acts of resistance can be used against the women in the justice system and by statutory services. Therefore, we hope to ensure the acts of women's resistance are acknowledged and used to benefit the situation by properly contextualizing the efforts that women make in the process. Women's resilience might include spoken or unspoken acts that attempt to stop, reduce, or prevent violence. And I'm sure many of you are aware that women try to stop the violence. Many times we talk about the women want the violence to stop, and sometimes they want to continue in the relationship. Resilience can be seen in two parts. There is external and internal, and both contribute to a person's capacity to survive in the face of adversity. When it comes to external forms of resilience, this is usually about maintaining positive, close relationships to family, friends, or community members, and obviously there might be other ways that people show external resilience. Internally, women can show resilience, and this can occur at personal levels. For instance, having a sense of purpose, sense of competence, utilizing humor and empathy, adapting to one's circumstances and environment, and demonstrating ability to socially problem solve. Although resilience is common to human beings, there are cultural differences, and there is some research that analyzed a diverse set of psychology studies on human resilience, and noticed that Western definitions of resilience typically emphasize individual personality traits at a personal level, so more individualistic. However, for immigrants from countries that identify with collectivist cultures, this individualistic approach to resilience might disregard culturally specific values. So it's very important to keep in mind the individual differences in human resilience, so to ensure that although there are some similarities, there is also differences within and between groups. Now we're moving into how we identify resistance, and there might be lots of other ways, and people in the audience might know about other ways of identifying resistance or what resistance means. But for the purposes of this session, over the next slides, I'll go through the 4 types identified, which are physical, verbal, psychological, and non-resistance. And this can be applied for, by women who experience domestic violence and or sexual violence. Physical resistance, there was a study done by Covina in which women who were female offenders, they were asked about the resistance strategies, the physical resistance strategies that they had utilized, and 26 women were interviewed, and 41% of them reported resisting physically the aggressor. In another study, the Campbell, Cab, and Ned and Rose study, 50% of 32 women who participated also reported that they used physical resistance to violence. At the Immigrant Women Support Service, we're aware of women who have physically resisted violence from the perpetrator. However, their resistance, instead of being understood as an act of self-defense or self-protection, have been construed as an act of violence or mutual combat. And I guess it's quite interesting, the link between the female offenders who use physical violence, physical resistance to their aggressor. And I'm sure you will be familiar with instances where women have physically resisted violence from a partner, only to end up with a domestic violence order against her, or she might end up with cross orders. Women who might leave physical marks on the perpetrator of the abuse might be considered the aggressor regardless of previous violence from the perpetrator. So the issue of physical resistance also presents lots of challenges to the women. The next form of resistance is verbal, and that can take many forms, including asking the perpetrator to stop the assault or begging the sexually coercive perpetrator to stop. Women might also ask the perpetrator to seek help as a way of verbally resisting the abuse. The types of resistance, according to the research, include threatening, crying, begging, yelling, and trying to reason with the perpetrator. I'm sure for those of you who have experienced assisting women in situations of domestic violence or sexual assault, you are very familiar with these types of resistance. In the iOS little research project, 30.8% of the 26 women who sought support from iWest verbally resisted a perpetrator at least once, and this is from the notes, the case notes. The next form of resilience is psychological resistance. Sorry, I'm confusing my resistance with my resilience. From the iWest research project, we didn't identify psychological resistance, which means that the information was either not recorded or not disclosed by the women. However, from the literature reviewed, psychological resistance might include things like shaking the beer bottle before serving it to the perpetrator, and some other acts that might look funny but give the women some sense of control over the situation. So psychological resistance is defined as playing tricks or engaging in mind games with the perpetrator. And this was utilized by 14% of the 26 women who participated in the Corbin study. The last form of resistance is not resisting, and I'm sure, again, we're all very familiar with this form of resistance. And this is perhaps the most overlooked. And this is when a woman makes a conscious decision, therefore it becomes a form of resistance. The 16% of women who reported to have not resisted to the physical and or sexual violence perpetrated against them in Corbin's study did so in order to protect themselves from being killed or injured with a weapon. A form of not resisting that responds to verbal, emotional, and or psychological abuse from a perpetrator was identified in another study as a woman's proactive decision to subordinate herself. Women who choose to subordinate themselves in different ways in order to avoid escalating verbal or physical violence from their partners, which could, lead them to harm and perhaps to be killed. In the Immigrant Women's Support Service file review, 38.5% of the 26 women took legal action to reduce, prevent, or stop the perpetrator's violence. I think that not resisting might also include seeking support from others in positions of authority or perceived by the women in positions of authorities, so they can resist on their behalf. However, the claim is not supported by the research, but, I'm thinking that when the women seek legal redress, in some ways they are not resisting themselves, perhaps, but getting somebody else to do it on their behalf. But as I said, I cannot claim that this is totally true, but it's something that I'm interested in following up. The research also shows that resistance helps nurture women's resilience. And although some women found in some of the studies that some of the ways they resisted were not very successful, they still showed an ability to evaluate the effectiveness of their actions relative to the context and readjust accordingly, which demonstrate the women's problem-solving abilities. From the IWS file, Immigrant Women Support Service file review, although we cannot assert that what exactly motivated the women to seek support from the service, it might be possible to infer that 46% of the women self-referring might have evaluated past actions and sought external support as a problem-solving strategy when other attempts had been assessed as unsuccessful by the women themselves. And of course, courage was necessary for the women to resist, and when the efforts were successful, the women who were participants in the studies reported experiencing a feeling of control. Their ability to evaluate and strategically execute resistance tactics in stressful and changing circumstances are qualities of internal resilience which are possessed by survivors of violence. Resistance can help nurture women's resilience in the form of gaining a sense of self-worth and competence, as well as demonstrating their ability to adapt to challenging circumstances. In here, my question is how systemic barriers affect a woman's resilience when she has made all possible efforts to stop the abuse, but because of lack of resources or due to their immigration status, she has to return to the perpetrator of the domestic violence, or she might be exposed to further sexual assault if she has to seek free accommodation if she doesn't have access to an income. So those are questions that I guess have arisen from doing this project research. There is also a qualitative case study that analyzed the migration and adjustment stories of 8 immigrant women in the United States. Most women highlighted that their inner strength came from their relationship with other women in their community and family that they could connect with on a cultural and or religious level. And the customs and traditions and celebrations that were culturally or religiously based, as well as passed down in the family, gave the women a sense of comfort and value as a member of society. 34.6% of the women accessing support from the Immigrant Women Support Service expressed enjoyment of a particular activity that gave them purpose, helped them cope, and or gave them a sense of competence. In terms of, all these help and become tools that serve the women help them survive in the face of adversity. Women who have experienced domestic violence and or sexual abuse already, have a remarkable amount of resilience that deserves to be recognized as an empowering trait with the potential for even more growth that we as service providers should try to better utilize in supporting the women. Internal resilience is the other component of resilience, and despite the stressors that immigrant women face, many of the women in the Yakushko and Morgan Consolis study recognized that learning how to manage and adapt to these challenges over time gave them a sense of accomplishment and strength. The process of learning the norms, resources and systems of a new culture relevant to the gender roles of these women, encouraged and elicited their abilities to socially problem solve, adjust to change, and rely upon themselves as factors of their internal resilience. The Immigrant Women Support Service file review identified 7.6 of the women source accommodation resources by themselves. And it also showed that 30.8% of the women reporting having been or being students at the time, and 46.2% were employed or were actively seeking employment. So this is despite the stresses brought about by dealing with abuse and by having uncertainty about their immigration status in Australia. So that's a very strong display of resilience. I'm just having a look at that slide. Is that one that we just did? No. Okay, sorry. So the case study of the 8 immigrant women to the U.S. also identified several external resilience factors as crucial to helping immigrant women manage the stressful adaptation to a new country. Most of the women highlighted that their inner strength came from the relationships with other women in the community and family that they could connect with on a cultural and or religious level. Of the 26 women who accessed support from the Immigrant Women Support Service and were included in this file review, 34.6% requested and were provided assistance to connect culturally. 80.8% requested and were provided with culturally specific services. All women, past and current women accessing support from the Immigrant Support Service, they all access culturally specific services. Therefore, the cultural connections are obviously very important as the women choose to access a service that provides culturally sensitive services. And we all know that, of course, the women might choose to go to mainstream services. But for the women who access IWES, and we're talking about over 400 women per year, that shows, the women's commitment to connecting with their communities. Some time ago in 2011, we had an activity, a women's group activity, and you can see in the slide some pictures with the word embracing at the top. This was a piece of artwork by a group of women. The process that the women went through, they met over, several sessions, and the women created images of women as they would like to see them. And the main themes resulting from these activities were strong, connected to others, supportive, free, and happy. So from the activities from the women's group, some of the pictures that were taken were put on a canvas in which the women printed words such as support, happiness, freedom, love, strength, and trust. And also the word woman in different languages. And obviously that's how they like to see the images of women. The Yakushko study found that many of the customs, traditions, and celebrations that were culturally or religious based. Oh, I think I said that before. Well, also gave the women a sense of comfort and value as a member of society. And this is why it's so important and relevant, because it's not uncommon that some women are ostracized from their community when they disclose abuse, whether that's domestic violence or sexual assault. Whilst, other communities or people in some communities can be very supportive. So, the connection is very important. Many women accessing support from the Immigrant Women Support Service reported participating in ethno-specific activities or celebrations, and some women report being involved in voluntary work with ethno-specific or multicultural organizations and groups, which shows again that need for the connection. A study conducted in 2013 located the importance of spiritual support and interpersonal relationships in the recovery of 37 women between the ages of 22 to 64 who had experienced domestic violence. And this is about spirituality, and regardless of what sort of spirituality we're talking about or what sort of religion people belong to, the participants of to this study felt that this connection with spirituality or religion gave them a sense of purpose and value that continued over time in the recovery of the abuse. For those who joined formalized, organized groups, religious groups, 19 expressed that these communities gave them emotional support and strength, particularly after the abuse. In terms of the women who access support services from IWAS, some of the women who have been past clients have reported actively participating in religious or spiritual activities. Some women have asked to be connected to churches and other religious or spiritual groups, and in some instances, women have asked for the intervention of spiritual leaders in an attempt to getting support to stop the abuse. According to Anderson, the 26 participants who acknowledged the support of the families reported that the support did not happen until after the women had left the perpetrator. The women emphasized that in the first 2 years, the close relationship with family, friends, and employers were crucial to building the courage to leave the perpetrators and create their own abuse-free lives without feeling isolated. The Immigrant Women Support Service review found that 57.7% of the women reported having received emotional and or material support from their friends and family members. Research has also found that community resources such as domestic violence and counseling services were found to be helpful to most women who access these services, looking for housing and ways to heal from trauma. And you can see on the slides some of the feedback provided by women accessing support from our service. I'm not going to read it out because you can see it. So although as a service we might wish to claim some credit for the women's success in achieving a life free from violence, this would not be possible without the women's ability and efforts to resist the violence and overcome the barriers they face in the process. So this is taking us to the end of my presentation, and I just have some concluding remarks. The study that we did was very small, and it was just a review. So we don't pretend that we have done anything that is bigger than what we actually did, but we felt that it was important to share it with people who have an interest in working with women from immigrant and refugee backgrounds. So we believe that this is the first stepping stone towards acknowledging, celebrating, and building on the many efforts women make to live a life free from violence. We also believe that despite settlement challenges and systemic barriers, immigrant and refugee women accessing support services from the Immigrant Women Support Service demonstrate similar examples of resilience and resistance as their counterparts who participated in research studies overseas. Due to the many limitations of the Immigrant Women Support Research Project, obviously we cannot draw any definite conclusions, but this piece of work at least gives us some idea of how women's resistance to violence nurture the resilience and this may explain how women survive dreadful situations of abuse. Having a better understanding of women's resistance to violence in any of the forms resistance might take is helpful in safety planning with immigrant and refugee women, as this information gives us an understanding of why and what women prioritize in relation to their safety and the safety of the children, of course. It is also hoped the information gathered through the iWest research project is helpful to service providers who might not have expertise in providing services in the areas of domestic violence and sexual violence, to help them better understand and respect women's decision-making processes. And I also hope that this research project generates interest for further research into these topics, as we have very limited research on immigrant and refugee women in Australia. So I'm open to your questions, ideas, feedback, and comments. And thank you for listening. We're just having a look at some of the questions. So there's a question, this one, so where these files of treatment women were receiving, we actually don't provide treatment as such. We provide support services, and that might involve case management, crisis intervention, counseling. So because, we're not a health service. Do we need to say the name? That was a question from Nada Ibrahim. Hello, Nada. Did these women share stories about their experiences with the justice system? That's another question from Nada. We didn't pick up the stories because not all the time the women go through the justice system because of the many challenges and barriers that can be posed by the system. So, but we are aware of the difficulties, like, courts not engaging interpreters, granting orders or cross orders when we believe that, there shouldn't be a cross order, domestic violence order, or family law. When women go through the family law system, sometimes orders are generated that are not really workable. We have another question. Do we have a data for comparison between immigrant and Australian women? That's from Odette Tufik. Sorry if I spelled that surname wrong. No, I'm not aware of any data, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Another question from Odette is how long your service following up with the women after helping her in resettlement. Actually, we're not a settlement service, but if the women happen to come to us through that process, we'll support them until they can achieve safety. And if they have, sometimes the women may say, look, I'm really, thankful for the work you have done. I feel that, I'm happy with my situation now because they feel safe and some of the issues have been resolved. But if they need to come back at any time, they're welcome to come back to the service. So, what kind of services maybe move to another one. Sorry, some people had problems with audio. There's another question from Odette. Can you please tell me what are the most common reasons for women to accept the violence as per your studies? I don't think that I'm claiming that the women accept the violence. I think on the contrary, I'm talking about how women resist the violence. And you know, when we're talking about why we don't use the term victim, because that gives them, you know, label women as passive. But you know, sometimes the women have to take on a more passive role because of the threat to their lives or the lives of the children, because you know, women might be killed because of domestic violence, or they might be killed in a sexual assault. Can you say? We're just going through the questions, sorry. This one, I can see a lot of similarities with Indigenous women's situation. Thank you for your comment. You know, we know that I agree that we have similarities, and there's also differences in terms of, you know, Indigenous women's dispossession and historical issues, which, you know, we always need to make sure that we acknowledge. That's there's another question from Gally Mackenzie. I'm wondering if you have had opportunity to know if the women had experienced domestic violence or sexual abuse prior to arrival in Australia. Yes, some women have experienced domestic violence in the country of origin. Some women might have experienced sexual abuse. Some women might have experienced sexual assault in refugee camps. So yes, some women have the experience before migrating to Australia, whilst others have the experience for the first time whilst settling in Australia. Another question from Lucy Morgan. Did you identify any differences between the experiences of refugee women as opposed to migrant women? No, we didn't identify, but that's a really good point, because the experiences might be different considering the you know, the background of refugee women and the prior experience to settlement. There is another one from Kate Travers. Any suggestions for overcoming the barrier of language when working with a woman who is a refugee via translation? That's a great question, Kate. You know, we work with interpreters every day, and we're aware of many services in Queensland that work with interpreters to ensure that communication is as accurate as possible. But I agree with you that, you know, there are some barriers, but the difficulty of not having an interpreter is that we might not get information that is accurate. And you know, in reviewing the papers from our little research project, I was thinking about how much information about resistance and resilience might be lost because it's not interpreted. Because you know, in an interpreting situation, and sometimes in a situation of the woman might be in crisis, I'm not sure whether the interpreters sometimes might not interpret some of the information because they try to target what they might consider more relevant. But I think it's something that needs follow up. Was there any This is another question from Mirjana Wilson. Was there any indication in the research that in accessing spiritual religion support, this had an adverse effect in pressuring a person to stay in the relationship? No, there wasn't, you know, an indication, but it doesn't mean that that's not an issue, and we have experienced that as well. And I should have mentioned that sometimes, you know, I did talk about community ostracizing, and that includes sometimes due to religious or spiritual reasons. Thank you for that question, Mirjana. There's another one from John Key. Are women from cold background but with higher education different from women with little or no education in the way they deal with domestic violence? No, I haven't, some women might have more financial resources, but not necessarily. I think violence affects women, um, that violence doesn't recognize, education or social background. So no, I don't think that there are, differences now in the way they deal with the domestic violence. If the women have resources, perhaps they don't come to a service like ours. Maybe they go to a private lawyer, but I cannot give you an evidence-based response. Any more time for any other questions? So, there's a question from Zina. Did you find a difference in reporting violence and resistance amongst women from different cultures and backgrounds? Yeah, that's a very good point, because I think it has to, when we talked about resilience and the differences between collectivist versus more individualistic societies, I think there are some differences, but I cannot give you again an evidence-based response. But it's like there are differences between groups and within groups, and that's I guess is something that happens across all cultures. I'm just looking. There is a comment by John again. The strategy to resist by not resisting was used by most women in Sierra Leone to save their lives and the life of their children by rebels, not resisting sexual abuse. Yeah, thank you for your comment. Then there's another question from Viviana Torres Opaso. I can say that really well. Do we have a comparison data between the visas that women are on? Are women more or less likely to seek help from you or other services depending on the visa and support system they have in place already? We didn't do a comparison data because the files were chosen at random, but we are aware of the challenges that women on 457 visas or student visas or other temporary visas face in terms of challenges and barriers to access support. There is another question. From all the women that were employed, do you know if they were getting appropriate support from their workplace? Do any of them lost their employment as a result of their situation? And Herbert, I wouldn't say that from the 26 files because I don't know, but from experience working with women from non-English speaking backgrounds, some women do lose their employment, and that's when it becomes economic abuse, because economic abuse is not just about the perpetrator withholding funds or not giving money, but it's also about preventing the women from accessing their workplace or attending the workplace. We're aware that some workplaces can be supportive, but for other women, it depends on whether they can disclose the violence and whether they feel confident that they can talk about it. So, but I couldn't answer your question in terms of whether they lost their employment. But I'm sure, and we know that women do lose their employment because of domestic violence or because of sexual assault. If they're dealing with sexual assault issues and they're having difficulties sleeping, or if they have nightmares or flashbacks, it's really hard to function. So I'm sure that a lot of women have lost their employment, or they had to interrupt their studies. And that's a big issue for international students when they have to comply with some visa requirements. I think we don't have any more time for questions. I really would like to thank you all. We have lots and lots of questions and some comments as well. So I do appreciate your interest in the topic, and I do hope that, you know, what we have done at the Immigrant Women Support Service is of a little bit of help, and hopefully, you know, it helps us to get people interested in doing some research on the topic. Thanks a lot.